year, the preacher must write a new Easter sermon. And it's a challenge to say something creative or new that speaks to the particular moment. And we have to admit that sometimes it's actually difficult to proclaim and sing the day of resurrection. 2 years ago, for instance, we had just completed 2 weeks of responding to the now infamous statement that gay people are a bigger threat to the United States than terrorists. This year, Easter comes in a week in which we have lobbied the state legislature about hate crimes, while there are reports of anti-gay hate crimes in Claremore, investigations into the death of a local activist, and increasing anti-Muslim rhetoric. Plus, one of our dear community leaders is seriously ill after a series of cardiac arrests. Lifting our gaze from our local setting, we see atrocities in Uganda, a clergy sex abuse scandal that is developing into a global nightmare, suicide bombers in Moscow subways, and the Great Barrier Reef threatened with an oil spill. So one would be excused from wondering for a moment if history really did change that week in Jerusalem, if God's reign has truly come on earth, if the resurrection actually signaled a new creation. Well, this Easter Sunday, we are offered the vision of the prophet Isaiah, a vision of the world at peace, where the wolf and lamb shall feed together, the lion shall eat straw like the ox, and they shall not hurt or destroy in all my holy mountain. Isaiah's vision of peace is centered on the city of Jerusalem, a city with peace in its very name, but a city which has, of course, now very little peace. In his book, The Crusades Through Arab Eyes, Amin Malouf records the repeated conquest of Jerusalem by Christians and Muslims during the Crusades, each group intent on possessing this holy city for themselves. Now, some of the conquerors and rulers were a little more enlightened than others, particularly the Kurdish Muslim Saladin, who did allow Christians and Jews to live peacefully in the city and allowed pilgrims to visit. But one reads painfully of the various atrocities committed in the name of religion. And of course, the last 2 weeks, Jerusalem has been in the news again, as the Israeli government has authorized new settlements in East Jerusalem, the part of the city that the Palestinians hope will one day be their capital. 27 centuries after this Isaiah-anic vision of Jerusalem, where no more shall the sound of weeping be heard in it or the cry of distress, we are still fighting over this city named for peace. Well, faced with reality, it's understandable that some might conclude that the hope expressed this day of new creation, life, and peace is merely an ideal. An ideal to be aimed at, aspired to, of course, but ultimately illusory. And you wouldn't be alone in holding that view of the Easter story. The Luke Gospel tells us that when the women returned to the disciples, that the disciples thought they were telling an idle tale. Well, I believe that to hold such a view is to succumb to despair. Our Easter faith is precisely one of hope. We believe that at the cross and the empty tomb, that the powers and principalities were defeated, and that we are liberated to live into the reign of God. Now, sure, that often runs into the hard wall of what we call reality. But it is by our Easter faith that we keep moving forward, never giving up, demonstrating through courage and love that we see with new eyes, that we see the universe is bending towards justice, as Dr. King, whose birthday is today, we celebrate. And we, as the body of Christ, are going to help it bend just a little bit further. Christ is risen. Raise your spirits from the caverns of despair. Walk with gladness in the morning. See what love can do and dare. Well, listening to Isaiah 65 a few moments ago, You probably delighted in its masterful poetry, its command of images and metaphors. Maybe you were inspired by the vision that it cast. In first reading it this week, I was exalted by it, but I must confess that I viewed it simply as an ideal, a dream to strive for, not some sort of practical program for the children of God. After all, its literal vision has not come true. Jerusalem has not known peace, as its history and our recent news remind us. But I was convicted by Walter Brueggemann's commentary on this passage. He did declare it a glorious artistic achievement, but went on to say it is also an act of daring, doxological faith that refuses to be curbed by present circumstances. This poet and the Isaiah tradition, more generally, knows that Yahweh's coming newness is not contained within our present notions of the possible. Brueggemann then went on to claim that the qualities exhibited in this passage are not simply theological ideals, but conditions that prevail in actual social relationships. Well, so he calls me to turn again and look at this passage. In the midst of all this beautiful poetry, was there actually a practical guide for how we are to live together as the people of God? Does Isaiah 65 contain a recipe for peace in the city? We'll explore with me for a moment. But first, let me take a moment to give you a little biblical scholarship, some background. Isaiah 65 is a part of the section of the book that scholars call Third Isaiahs, chapters 56 to 66. Scholarly consensus is that the first 39 chapters were constructed in the 8th century before Jerusalem had been captured by King Nebuchadnezzar and the people carried off into Babylon. The second section of the book, likely written during the exile, and this final section comes as the Jews had returned to Judea and were struggling to rebuild the city and the country and their life and faith. Now there's scholarly disagreement over whether the three sections have three major writers or figures that we can point to, or whether there's just a school of thought that develops after the first 8th century prophet of Isaiah, when that school developed and assembled the book. But I'll give you that little bit of scholarly information so that you might understand that the one who wrote this poem was writing during a period when Jerusalem was being rebuilt, and they were striving to create a just society, knowing full well that prior to the exile, their society had been far from just. They had exploited the poor. They had ignored the righteousness of God. Well, after the introductory words of praise, one notices in verse 20 that the poet writes about infant mortality. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't really read a lot of poetry that talks about infant mortality. Infant mortality usually comes up in statistical analyses, some World Health Organization report comparing various countries and ranking them, not usually the stuff of poetry. But Isaiah 65 is talking about infant mortality and life expectancy, which are the same sorts of categories that we continue to use in the 21st century to judge a nation by. Well, this discussion of infant mortality and life expectancy is a sign that we are dealing with practical issues of actual social relationships. And yes, Isaiah 65 is describing what a peaceful city ought to look like. And first off, it is saying that a just and peaceful city will be one with low infant mortality and long life